Time simply stopped here nearly 80 years ago. This is Skansen, right in the bustling heart of Stockholm, the largest, most sophisticated and most celebrated open-air museum of living history in the world. It covers some 70 acres of a commanding hilltop on one of the many islands on which Stockholm is built. A collection of some 150 houses and farms, illustrating in exact detail every period of Swedish history from the 15th century to the early 20th. It was started nearly 80 years ago by one pioneering enthusiast who was concerned to preserve a living picture of farm and village life in Sweden at a time when rapid industrialization was beginning to revolutionize the age-old traditional patterns of Swedish country life. And ever since then, it's been growing larger and larger as more and more houses from the remoter regions have been dismantled and then reassembled here in exact contemporary period detail and peopled once again with livestock and with craftsmen working at their ancient arts. Sweden's Skansen is now synonymous all over the world with this kind of living museum. And in the northeast of England today, there are plans afoot for an open-air industrial museum that might one day rival Skansen itself, the brainchild of one tireless crusader, museum director Frank Atkinson. For 10 years, he has been director of the Bowes Museum at Barnard Castle in County Durham. And for these 10 years, he's been assiduously collecting all manner of period pieces of machinery, large and small, industrial and agricultural, like this discarded seed drill from a farm near Seaton.
Oh, you have to, I see, so that stays on the same axis, that's the same position, but this moves up and down to it.
That's right.
I've got it, yes.
Its destination is one of the many repositories throughout the northeast where Atkinson has been storing his growing collection, a disused army camp at Branspeth near Durham. Already he has gathered some 10,000 period items ranging from the last hand-fired gasworks and a complete village railway station to a fleet of coal trucks. And here at Branspeth he has what he calls, only half-jokingly, his indoctrination hut.
One of the problems of setting up an open-air museum is the very difficulty of letting people know what it's going to look like when it's completed. There are no examples at all in England where one can do this. So early on we had the idea of setting up a sort of indoctrination centre where we could really let people see what it could look like. For example, this chemist shop which we've set up in this hut, it's not an ideal place, but it gives one an idea of what it could look like in the open-air museum. It's a chemist shop we got from Stockton. In fact, it belonged to the man who invented the friction match. We set it up here to give some idea of how it could look when the open-air museum is completed. Of course, then it would be in a complete building. The visitor would be able to see the outside as well as the inside, but at least this gives some idea. And then over there, we set up an Edwardian pub. It's actually the Duke of Wellington from Darlington. And this again, we've tried to make it as exact as possible, although it's within this hut. And with special visitors, we can even give them a small drink. And so give an idea of just how living, how alive an open-air museum could be. And then, to let them see the way their grandparents used to live, we bring them in here. It's a complete rebuild of a miner's cottage of about 1890.
Where did this cottage come from?
It came from Evenwood in County Durham. It's the complete interior of one cottage. Of course, here we've got it in rather mock surroundings, but in the open-air museum proper, one would hope to have an exact row of miners' cottages, complete with their gardens and so on. And inside, one would again find contents of this kind.
And will you try to have people actually apparently living in the cottages as they do at Skansen?
I think one would have to feel one's way on this. One doesn't want the thing to look too theatrical and false.
How complete a picture of the northeast have you managed to gather together already?
As complete as we possibly could, we've tried to cover every possible facet of the way of life and to be as unselective as possible, not to say this is a nice object or I don't like the look of this, but to take everything which was available.
And how much have you got so far?
Oh, an immense amount of material. We've got more than 10,000 catalogued cards, and when you think that the contents of the chemist shop we saw a little time ago is catalogued as one group on a card, you see what 10,000 can mean. People have been remarkably generous. Almost everything has been given to us. Of course, we bought a few things at farm sales, and we paid scrap iron price for some of the very larger pieces of machinery, but otherwise practically everything has been given.
Now, you've spent 10 years, Mr. Atkinson, collecting all these things together. Why are you collecting what some people might call just a load of old junk while it's still so recent?
Well, I feel that if one is going to show a picture of life in a region, then one has to have everything, be it good or bad. And this is what we've tried to do, so that we haven't used a personal criteria of whether or not a thing is beautiful, but whether it is or has been typical of the region, so that it's the historical accuracy which we have been looking for, not the beauty. Some things are beautiful and attractive, but many of them are just utilitarian. But we have collected them for this reason. But indeed, it's getting terribly desperate, very urgent, the collecting of this material, because it is disappearing so very rapidly nowadays. More and more material is going every day, and it's getting more and more urgent that we should collect whilst the things are still here. Otherwise, when we are able to start the museum, we shan't have the things we need. In fact, we probably ought not to be sitting here talking now. I ought to be going out collecting something at this minute which is probably being destroyed.
It might seem merely perverse to find beauty in a place like this, and yet to the industrial archaeologist, Seaham Harbour here is an absolute paradise, a microcosm of the industrial northeast, carved out of the cliffs by the third Marquess of Londonderry exactly 140 years ago. And to this day, sailors simply call it the hole in the wall. It was built specifically as an outlet for the local collieries of the rich Durham coalfields. And yet, for many years now, it's really been out of date. That splendid paddle steamer of a tug, well, there were 3 of them operating in this harbour only 3 years ago, but now the Reliant is the very last of her kind. And these coils of hand-wrought iron chains are fast going out of use too, because as the coal mining industry dwindled in the 30s, there was no money to modernize Seaham. And so Seaham Harbour, with its surrounding fretwork of giant wooden stays carrying the railway lines on stilts around it, remained a perfect example of the 19th century imprisoned in the dusty amber of history. But now a belated modernization program is chipping away at that amber, and preservation has suddenly become urgent. Only 5 years ago, a giant coal drop that used to stand up on the escarpment behind me there was saved from demolition just in the nick of time by Frank Atkinson. It's the sheer size of these monstrous industrial relics that has always been a bar to their preservation. But with effort and much willing cooperation from local industry, the steam winding engine from Shotton Colliery, including its 6-ton flywheel, one of the last in the northeast, has been rescued and put into storage. Redevelopment is now changing the landscape of the northeast almost as radically as the Industrial Revolution did. This was its birthplace, the world's cradle of the age of steam and iron. But its abandoned monuments stand in the way of further progress. British Rail have made a gift of this early water pumping station at Belmont Junction. But it's got to be saved soon, for its function is gone and its time is running out. The march of the supermarkets is driving a great swathe through the little towns that sprang up to house and service the expanding population. Not all the buildings being pulled down now have any architectural distinction, but they happened, the cottages and the pubs and the little shops. They were local and typical, and one day we would regret it if not a single one was left. Atkinson steps in to salvage the most significant details, like, for instance, the frontage of this 19th century pub in Chesterley Street. Atkinson's brief is to build up a complete and intimate picture of the Northeast at work and at play, warts and all, for reassembly later. Buildings can be saved, but it's very much harder to preserve the men and the skills that forged a new technological civilization. The chainmaker's workshop at Winleton only closed down 2 years ago. This was how they made the great hand-wrought chains that lie rusting at Seaham Harbour. The chainsmith and his apprentice would like to go on working even in a museum, just as they do at Skansen, to illustrate and perpetuate this dying skill. Atkinson has already salvaged all the equipment. It needs a museum now to fan this last remaining spark into flame again. Deep in the heart of the countryside, you find the first and the last, an 18th century steel furnace at Derwentcote dating from the earliest beginnings of the iron industry in the Derwent Valley. This curious beehive-shaped building housed a primitive system of making blister steel from iron by cooking it for 5 days. No one knows when it went out of use, but Atkinson wants to get it back into production, the first of the dark satanic mills, and the last to survive. They do have a curious kind of beauty about them, some of these monuments. The 19th century lead mill in Weardale has now grown into the moorland landscape and will be preserved there as a positive amenity. And the more that you look at them in their natural setting, the more you become attracted to their peculiar charm, their gaunt angularity, the crude air of confident physical power which still invests the pit-winding engine at Beamish. Visitors to the open-air museum would travel around it by tramcar. Atkinson plans to rebuild a whole village, and for that purpose, an old Gateshead tram is coming home again, donated by British Rail. The museum won't ignore the pastoral Northeast by any means, but primarily it will reflect that period of huge pioneering energy that made Britain the powerhouse of the world, and the Northeast the powerhouse of Britain. And it's this sense of shared pride and achievement that has roused local industry's enthusiasm for the project. The Gateshead tram, for instance, is being stored free of charge by a local ironworks until such time as Atkinson's museum is ready to receive it. One object, one artifact from bygone times symbolizes that whole virile era, the Cauldron Wagon for hauling coal, direct descendant of the farm wagon. This is the shape of the industrial Northeast, not to be found anywhere else. The Coal Board and Seaham Harbour Dock Board have given Atkinson about 30 of them. The rest are gone. Atkinson has used it as the symbol of his whole museum project on a stream of publicity brochures and pamphlets issued by a supporting association of enthusiasts who held a press conference earlier this year to rally support from the public and from the local authorities who would have to help finance it. The press conference was to launch the idea in detail, for Atkinson had already earmarked a particular site for his dream, Beamish Estate in the heart of County Durham. The whole project depended on getting this site and getting it quickly to provide a home for the disappearing past.
And what we are thinking of in terms of this museum is not merely to record the dead past, but to record and perpetuate something which is fundamental to the technological circumstances of the present and basic to the advances that have occurred and have yet to occur. And at this point, If you'll allow me, I will turn immediately to Mr. Atkinson and ask him if he would speak to us for a moment or two on something which is so near to his heart and which we all want to lend our support to. Mr. Atkinson.
Well, Professor Daish, may I first of all thank the Friends of the Northern Regional Open Air Museum for so very kindly inviting me along to take part in this meeting this morning. When I tell you that, for instance, at the moment, things, that is to say actual individual specimens or groups of material, are being offered at the rate of just about one a day, and this has now been going on for several years, you'll realize the size of the collection, because when I say a group of things, this can be one or two items, it may be 50, 100, or even 1,000.
Well, gentlemen, I feel pretty confident that you may want to ask a number of questions.
Could you do the arithmetic? What's an eighth of a penny rate? What sort of rate are we dealing with?
I think it's, I'm not a financier, but I believe that an eighth of a penny in the region would probably yield somewhere about £60,000 per annum. And I understand that this sort of figure would be more than sufficient to run this museum.
Just before we leave the finance world, who owns Beamish Hall?
The Coal Board.
Well, what's the price that they're asking for that? I mean, that's...
Well, I don't know what asking figure the Coal Board have, but it's not likely to be, one imagines, a tremendous item, because presumably they, at the moment at any rate, seem to have no other use for it.
As a possible subscriber, I'd like to know what the financial implications are of this and where we're going on it. And I think that if we're going to run a story on this tomorrow, we should be pretty specific about it.
Well, I think in part the figures that I have suggested to you were the figures that were in front of the first working party.
Yeah. Would this museum be self-sufficient eventually from the income of tourists?
Well, I think in the long term it could well be, because it clearly would charge admission, and it would have all sorts of things to sell as souvenirs, and it would no doubt charge for rides on the trams and all this sort of thing. There is every reason to believe that in the course of a few years it could well be self-sufficient.
Well, what sort of increase do you envisage for this, Mr. Atkinson?
Well, the site which the working party have had in mind at Beamish is about, I think, 270 acres.
Beamish Estate lies only a few miles off the A1 and the new Durham motorway, 6 miles from Newcastle.
It's an absolutely ideal site because it's basin-shaped, it's got woods all the way around it, there's a river running through the middle of it, and what's more, it's pretty well typical of the sort of countryside that one gets in the northeast. This is what we want, something which will really typify the whole region. And the limit is these woods along here, the woods you can see along the near skyline there, those woods all along practically along the skyline. So the whole area, which is about 300 acres, with the hall down in the bottom and the farm on the way down to the hall, really is a very attractive unit.
But by putting industrial buildings in this rather nice pastoral area, aren't you being just as destructive as the Victorians were when they industrialized it?
Well, one might think this, but in fact I think that the siting would be such that this wouldn't happen, and it would be much more small-scale development than, of course, the latest industrial development that we have had.
So there would be some agriculture left?
Oh yes, I think most of the land would still remain agricultural.
And the farm?
And the farm, I see that farm, which is now semi-derelict, as being capable of being brought back into its mid-19th century state, so that visitors would have an admirable opportunity of seeing just what mid-19th century farming was like in these parts. The centrepiece of the whole Beamish estate is Beamish Hall. It's a beautiful building in a warm sandstone, and it stands in the very centre of the site. It was the home of Bonnie Bobby Shafto, so it's got very pleasant family associations too. It's the sort of building that one needs as a centre to house the restaurant, to show initial displays because one can't put everything out of doors immediately, to have the offices and the many work rooms that one needs for this kind of material, so that it's superbly situated for all these purposes. It may be that later on it could also be used for other educational purposes too, but one does really need Beamish Hall. One really needs it as the centre of this museum.
Here at Skansen, even on a raw and glowering April afternoon, it doesn't take much effort of imagination to transform the silent acres of Beamish, the heaped-up piles of lifeless objects stored at Branspeth, into this kind of living, breathing, open-air museum. Like Skansen, it would be a family place, a lived-in place depicting a bygone world in action in its natural setting. Skansen is now big business as well as being an integral part of Stockholm's leisure life. Frank Atkinson thinks that his Beamish project could be established for less than £60,000 a year initially and might eventually become self-supporting. Certainly, if Skansen's example is anything to go by, there's no limit to the expansion that's possible. One of the keepers of buildings at Skansen is Dr. Ingemar Lehmann. Well, how much does it cost to run Skansen at present?
Well, we are not really self-supporting now. It costs roughly £700,000 a year to run the place. We have just over 1.5 million visitors now, compared with over 2 million visitors a few years ago. We are also re-adapting the whole idea of Skansen to suit the 70s at the moment, and that costs a lot, and we need some government and city assistance.
What's the real cultural value of somewhere like Skansen to Sweden, to Sweden as a nation?
To school children, of course, there is an enormous value. For example, I can tell you that every child in the Stockholm schools have to do a course up here at Skansen, and this is some kind of an illustration to their reading in books. If they, for example, study, say, the 17th century in the books, they can come up here and have a look at a 17th century farm to see how people worked here, how they lived, what was in a farm at that time. And the whole idea with Skansen as a teaching center is quite natural, because the founder of Skansen, he was to begin with a school teacher. Skansen was founded by the idealism, the enthusiasm of one single person, just as it is in your case. And because of his tremendous interest in the whole project, we are now able to show a place where people can get some kind of impression how their ancestors lived. To make it easier for them maybe to understand the background for their present situation, to make it into a link between the past and the present.
Last month, a working party from 9 local authorities came to Beamish Hall to study the site and discuss the possibility of purchase. Afterwards, the chairman of the group, Councillor Mrs. Macmillan, was enthusiastic about the prospects.
Well, I would hope that the future for an open-air museum in the north of England is indeed a rosy one. I think that most of you will appreciate that we've been looking for some long time for such a site. It's had its difficulties. I think that one has to realise that it has had its difficulties. But this was not because of any awkwardness on the part of anyone. It was because we wanted to get the right place and we wanted to make a success of it. Not for ourselves, but for the generations which are to follow. And having come here today and having looked around this, we feel very optimistic about the future.
Thank you.
Yes, all right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, it really looks as though things are going to happen at last, and the committee certainly are to be congratulated on having taken what must have been surely a very difficult decision at a time like this. So I really think that the museum is on the way, and perhaps one day, not very far away, the contents of this chemist's shop will take their place at last in the open-air museum. But it's still going to be difficult. There are still lots of things being destroyed daily which ought to be saved for the museum. But I think we have taken the first step, and one hopes it won't be long before the museum really gets on its feet at last.